They didn't just kill him. They boiled his head, not to destroy it, but to preserve it. They hung it by the doorway like a trophy. They sang to it at night. They believed his soul was trapped inside, forced to guard the home of the man who murdered him. This wasn't war. It was industry. For over 1,300 years, headhunting tribes in Borneo didn't just take lives. They harvested skulls. Not for torture, not for sacrifice, but for currency, for status, for power. You were taught that slavery, colonialism, and the Holocaust were the worst crimes in history. But no textbook mentions this. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, men, women, and children were hunted like deer, not for food, but so their severed heads could be traded like coins. A single skull could buy you a bride. 2 could get you land. 10 you became a chief. They didn't hide the records. They just didn't tell you where to look. Subscribe now, because this story was erased from your history books on purpose. Comment shocked if you believe this atrocity deserves to be taught in schools, because what comes next will make your blood run colder than a skull on a bamboo pole. It started with rice. Not war, not religion. Rice. In the 7th century, the Dayak people settled deep in the jungles of Borneo. They cleared the land, planted paddies, and built longhouses. Massive wooden villages on stilts, housing hundreds of families under one roof. But the soil was weak. The crops failed. Children starved. They believed the earth needed blood to grow food. Not animal blood. Human blood. Their shamans said the spirit of the paddy field, called Dua Paddy, demanded a life for every harvest. No death, no rice, no survival. So they went to the next village and took a head. The first victim was a farmer named Lanting. We know his name because his brother carved it into a tree before he died trying to avenge him. Lanting wasn't a warrior. He was 34, with 2 young sons. He was killed at dawn while checking his traps. A blow to the back of the neck with a mandau, a curved jungle axe. Then his head was severed with 3 clean cuts. His skull was boiled in a pot with herbs and charcoal for 2 days. The flesh fell off. The tendons snapped. The jaw was removed. Then it was hung in the longhouse of the chief who ordered the kill. That year the rice grew taller. The harvest doubled. The chief declared the land drinks best when it tastes man blood. What began as desperation became tradition. What began as survival became sport. By the 9th century, headhunting wasn't just about food. It was about rank. A man with no heads was worthless. A man with 1 head could marry. A man with 5 was respected. A man with 10, he could challenge the chief. Boys as young as 8 were taken to watch their first ngayo. They were forced to hold the skull of their first kill, still warm, still dripping, and told, "This is your future. This is your honor." Women celebrated headhunters like rock stars. Songs were composed for the number of heads a man brought back. Brides refused to marry men who hadn't taken a life. And if a man died without a single skull to his name, his family would buy one just to hang it at his funeral. Otherwise, he was buried like an animal. This wasn't madness. It was system. A system built on the idea that human life had no value unless it was taken. And once that idea took root, it grew like jungle vines. Thick, unstoppable, choking everything in its path. The blood of Lanting watered the first seed, but what came next would drown an island in skulls. This was not random violence. This was industry. Every headhunt had rules. Every skull had a price. Every killer was trained like a soldier. The process had 3 phases: recruitment, raid, ritual. Phase 1, recruitment. Boys were selected at age 12. They were stripped naked, beaten for 7 days, and left in the jungle for 48 hours with only a knife. If they returned, alive, with proof of killing an animal, they began training. They learned to move without sound, to kill with 1 hand, to sever a head in under 10 seconds. Their weapons were custom made. The Mandau axe had a blade forged from meteorite iron, believed to carry sky strength. It cost the equivalent of 6 cows to commission one. Each warrior was assigned a tua, a spiritual sponsor. This was usually an older headhunter who guided the soul of the new killer. The sponsor got half the spiritual credit for every head taken. Phase 2. The raid. Raids were planned like military operations. Scouts mapped enemy villages for weeks. They watched routines, found weak points, identified targets. Women and children were not spared. A child's head was worth more than an adult's because it was purer, stronger for the spirit world. The attack always came at dawn. Warriors entered silently, slit throats, then collected heads. One man's job was only to carry the skulls. He wore a rattan basket, called a sangal, designed to hold up to 12. After the raid, they retreated before sunrise. No trophies left behind. No survivors. Phase 3. Ritual. Back at the longhouse, the skulls were boiled for 48 hours in a pot with salt, lime, and turmeric. This cleaned the flesh and calmed the spirit. Then each skull was mounted on a dangkung, a wooden spike near the entrance. Position mattered. The first head hung highest. The most recent kill hung at eye level, so the chief could greet it daily. Each skull received a name, not the victim's real name that was erased. Instead, it was given a title like Guardian of the Threshold or Whisperer in the Wind. The warrior who took the head had to sit with it for 3 nights. No sleep, no food. He spoke to it, apologized, and ordered it to serve him in the afterlife. Breaking any rule brought disaster. If a skull was lost, the entire village fasted for a week. If a warrior refused to kill, he was exiled, and anyone could kill him on sight. And the proof this was real, not myth. Colonial records. In 1893, Dutch officer Hendrik van der Meer seized a longhouse in West Borneo. Inside, he counted 47 human skulls, all tagged with dates, names of killers, and reasons for the kill. One entry read, Skull #23, female, age 8, taken for harvest blessing, killer Tuan Anak, age 14. Reward 1 pig and right to wear red feathers. This wasn't chaos. This was law. A legal, spiritual, economic system where human heads were currency and murder was promotion. And the worst part? It wasn't just the Dayaks. By the 1500s, entire kingdoms in Borneo were built on the skull trade. Villages paid taxes and heads. Alliances were sealed with skull exchanges. One chief in Sarawak kept a skull ledger, a bamboo scroll listing every head he owned, traded or gifted. Total 218. He wasn't a monster. He was a leader, respected, feared, normal. This system didn't just happen. It was designed, and once it worked, it had to grow. You think the Atlantic slave trade was massive? It lasted 400 years. An estimated 12 million people were taken. Nagayo, the headhunting system of Borneo, lasted 1,300 years. And the death toll? We don't know the exact number, because no one was counting the victims, only the killers. But we have proof, hard numbers, colonial records, missionary logs, and tribal ledgers. In 1848, British explorer James Brooke, the self-declared White Raja of Sarawak, launched an investigation after discovering a longhouse with 112 skulls on display. He interviewed elders, studied oral histories, and cross-referenced raids. His conclusion? At least 30,000 heads were taken in Sarawak alone, between 1700 and 1850. That's 300 per year, 6 per week, 1 every 2.5 days. And Sarawak was just one region of Borneo. The island is 3 times the size of Britain, home to over 200 distinct tribes. By the 1800s, at least 40 of them practiced headhunting as a formal institution. Multiply Brooks' estimate by 5. Now you're looking at 150,000 dead, just in the last 150 years before colonial crackdowns. But this didn't start in 1700. It started in the 7th century. For over 13 centuries, men, women, and children were hunted like animals, not for food, not for war, but so their skulls could be collected. Think about that. The Roman Empire lasted 500 years. The Mongol Empire, 150. The British Empire, 300. This system outlasted them all. And it wasn't just isolated raids. It was constant. In 1897, Dutch patrols in West Borneo recorded 43 separate headhunting expeditions in a single month. One village, Tanjung Batu, reported 17 successful raids in 2 years. Total skulls taken 89. They weren't all enemies. Some were traders passing through. Others were from allied villages during disputes. Many were slaves, captured not for labor, but for decapitation. Yes, there was a slave class bred specifically for headhunting, called ulun. They were prisoners of war, debtors, or orphans. They lived in pens behind longhouses, fed just enough to stay alive. Killed only when a warrior needed a guaranteed head for a ritual or status upgrade. In 1905, a Dutch officer found a village where every adult male had at least 3 skulls. Population, 180. Skulls on display, 612. That means some men had 10 or more. And the women? They didn't just accept it. They demanded it. Marriage contracts from the 1800s list minimum skull ownership as a requirement. One document from 1873 states, bridegroom must present at least 4 skulls. If false, bride returns with half the dowry, and the man is branded. This wasn't a few savage tribes. This was a civilization built on decapitation, a system so widespread, so accepted, that entire economies ran on skull value. You could trade a head for 50 chickens, 3 water buffalo, 100 brass gongs, or a virgin bride. And the skulls, they weren't buried. They weren't hidden. They were displayed. In 1910, a German ethnographer photographed a longhouse in central Borneo. The roof was lined with over 200 skulls, bleached white, jaws removed, holes drilled for hanging. He asked the chief, "Don't you fear the spirits of the dead?" The chief laughed. "They don't haunt us. They serve us. We own them now." This wasn't war. This wasn't revenge. This was ownership. And the scale? It wasn't just thousands. It wasn't even tens of thousands. We are talking about a civilizational slaughter, lasting longer than Christianity has existed, that wiped out entire tribes, erased bloodlines, and turned human heads into commodities. And you've never heard of it. Why? Because the next section will show you this was never lost. It was buried. You were taught about Auschwitz, about slavery, about the killing fields of Cambodia, but not one word about 1,300 years of skull markets in Borneo. Why? Because the truth was buried, not by time but by design. Colonial powers knew. Missionaries documented it. Scientists studied it. And then they silenced it. The Dutch, British, and later the Indonesians didn't want to look like hypocrites. They were busy claiming they were civilizing the natives. But if they admitted that headhunting had been systematic, legal, and spiritually central for over a millennium, they'd also have to admit something worse. They didn't stop it. They profited from it. In 1853, the Dutch East India Company issued a decree: no punitive action shall be taken against native headhunting if it does not involve Dutch subjects. Translation: kill each other. Just don't touch Europeans. Why? Because headhunting kept tribes fighting each other, not the colonizers. Divide and rule. In 1876, a British colonial report stated, "The practice of Nyo serves to maintain tribal hostility, which reduces the risk of unified resistance against colonial authority." They allowed it. They encouraged it. Then they covered it up. After World War II, when Indonesia took control, the new government suppressed the history even more. Why teach your citizens that their ancestors were headhunters? It didn't fit the image of a modern nation. So textbooks were rewritten. Tribal elders were pressured to let go of the past. Museums removed skull displays. By 1960, the official story was headhunting was a rare, primitive custom practiced by a few isolated tribes and ended long ago. Lie. In 1999, during ethnic violence in Kalimantan, over 500 heads were taken in revenge raids between the Dayak and Madurese people, Photos exist. Journalists reported it. The Indonesian government blocked the news. One survivor, a Madures man named Samsul, escaped after watching his brother's head boiled in a pot. He said, "They sang, they danced, they hung the skull on a pole and said, 'This is justice.'" His testimony was removed from the final report. Academics stay silent too. Anthropologists who study Borneo avoid the topic. Why? Funding. Western universities don't want to fund research that makes indigenous cultures look savage. It's seen as racist to tell the truth. Dr. Evelyn Tan, a Malaysian historian, tried to publish a paper on skull ledgers in 2012. She was accused of cultural defamation. Her grant was revoked. Even today, Google Scholar returns 0 peer-reviewed studies that call headhunting a system of human commodification. Instead, they use soft words: ritual practice, spiritual tradition, cultural expression. They don't say, "This was mass murder for status," because that would force a question no one wants to answer. If a culture believes killing for skulls is sacred, is it still evil? And if we won't call it evil, are we complicit? Western museums hold thousands of Borneo skulls in storage. The British Museum alone has 187. They're labeled ethnographic artifacts, not evidence of a 13th century genocide. No plaques, no names, no justice. The victims erased, the killers romanticized as fierce warriors. Even documentaries tiptoe around it. National Geographic once filmed a Dayak elder polishing a skull. The narrator said, "A symbol of ancestral strength." They didn't say, "This man's great-grandfather murdered a child for this." This isn't ignorance. This is censorship. The records exist. The skulls exist. The survivors exist. But the story is suppressed because it doesn't fit the narrative. We want evil to be simple. Nazis in uniforms. Slavers with whips. Not grandfathers singing to a child's skull. Not brides refusing suitors for lack of kills. Not governments letting it happen for profit. So they buried it. Not in the jungle, in your mind. And the deeper it's buried, the more it grows. This is not ancient history. The last headhunting raid was in 2001. Not 1901, 2001. In the remote highlands of central Kalimantan, a Dayak war party attacked a Madures village. They killed 17 people. They took 14 heads. They boiled them in iron pots over open fires. Indonesian military troops arrived 3 days later. They found skulls hanging from trees, wrapped in red cloth. One had a pair of children's shoes tied to it, a trophy within a trophy. The soldiers didn't arrest anyone. They burned the longhouse, buried the skulls, and filed the report as inter-ethnic conflict. No arrests, no trials, no headlines. Because to call it what it was, ritual headhunting, would mean admitting the truth. This never ended. It was only driven underground. Today, in villages across Borneo, young men still train with the mandau. Elders still tell stories of the glory days when a man's worth was measured in skulls. Tourists are shown ceremonial displays, fake skulls, they are told. But in private, the practice continues. In 2015, a BBC investigative team posed as anthropologists in West Borneo. They met a man named Tumbang, a village chief. He showed them a hidden chamber beneath his home. Inside 27 skulls. The newest had been taken in 2013, a rival logger who disrespected the forest. Tumbang said, "The spirits demand balance. When land is harmed, blood must answer. We still majau, but quietly. This isn't tradition. This is continuity." The logic of Engayo, that human lives can be taken to gain status, power, or spiritual favor, still exists. We live in comfort. They lived in silence. Knowing changes everything. Subscribe, because silence is how suppression wins.